All we really have to cover is that second objectives. We're going to talk about cancer. We're going to answer a couple questions. That's going to be it for today. So if I get us all the way over to that, cancer is a group of diseases characterized by uncontrolled cell division. This box isn't big enough, so here you go. And you see cancer in the news all the time, right? They talk about cancer research and possible cures and everything else. But one of the major takeaways you're supposed to get when we're talking about something like this is that even in this definition, it says it's a group of diseases, right? It's not one specific thing. If it was one specific thing, it'd be easy to cure, right? Smallpox was a virus that we found a vaccine for. It's cured, right? It doesn't exist anymore. But cancer is not like that. Cancer is not a specific thing. Even if Brock and I happen to have the exact same cancer, we both have some skin cancer, right? It still could be different, right? Individual cases of the same kind of cancer are different. So there's no one cure for everybody, right? You might be able to help somebody, and there's a lot of treatments for cancer, but there are no actual cures. They don't really exist yet. There's a lot of money being pumped into research for cancer that's trying to help people ultimately, but most of that goes into different kinds of treatments, and treatments are not cures, not necessarily, right? They help somebody cope and manage it, but they don't necessarily fix the problem. So we're working on that, obviously, but understand that even if somebody does happen to be cured, right, their cancer is probably different than everybody else's. Everyone's individual case is just that. It's individual. It's unique. So cancer is really hard to cure because of that. There will never be just one cure because there's all sorts of different kinds of cancers, and even individuals with the same kind of cancer can have completely different things going on. But one thing that's characteristic to all of them is DNA damage. That's what ultimately causes that cancer. Now, the note under this talks about oncogenes, and you don't really know what those are. I barely remember what those are, but it's kind of complicated in reality. When I was learning about this in a genetics class in college, they talked about like 8 different things that had to go wrong before a cell was a cancer cell. So 8 different DNA damages that were all separate from each other. One of the things that you can take away again, the biggest thing that has to go wrong is you have to cut the brakes, right? You have to get it to start dividing uncontrollably. And that has a lot to do with those stop signs that we talked about, the checks in G2 and whenever else. So one of the things that does go wrong, for sure always, is they will avoid those stop signs and just go right through them, right? The cells continually divide without ever stopping, and that's part of the problem to begin with. But as far as knowing all the specific things that go wrong, again, we barely understand that, let alone would I expect you to answer that on a test. So there's lots of things that go wrong, but one of the big things is you got to cut those brakes, right? Instead of stopping to check at the end of G2 if that cell's ready to divide, it'll just keep dividing. Right? It doesn't stop ever, it just keeps going. But again, lots of different things do have to go wrong. Again, I think it was something like 8 different genetic mutations that you kind of need before a cell becomes cancerous. You can inherit some of those damages. One thing that you guys also should understand is that you cannot inherit cancer itself. Because if your original cell, you started out as one cell. If it was cancerous, you would have never become what you are. It's not possible. So you can't inherit cancer. You can't be born with it. But you can be born with certain DNA damage that could make it more likely for you to get cancer. So that's why they talk about history in like a medical checkup, things like that. They want to know if anybody in your family has had this cancer, this whatever, because some of that can be inherited. It would make you more likely to get that cancer. But you would still have to have damage in your lifetime before you could become become, or before you could get cancer. So make sure that you understand that some of it can be inherited, but you still would have to have damage of your own before it ever would really be a problem. So lots of different things happen, but just generally speaking, it all has to do with DNA damage. But that should also key you into this question. Right? We're supposed to talk about how apoptosis can help protect you from cancer. So again, I didn't ask you to get a marker again because I haven't done that at all this chapter. But if you wanted to discuss with a neighbor or something like that because you're not sure what the answer to this is, that would be a very good idea. But you're supposed to be talking about how those two things are connected. What does apoptosis and cancer have in common? Because once you figure that out, it's pretty easy to understand how apoptosis can help protect you from cancer. So go ahead and talk a little bit if you want. I'll have to draw a stick here in a second.
Well, there's do the DNA so if they look
Alright, so I think you might have kind of an idea. I'm going to go ahead and draw a stick. Might take a while to find somebody who's here. First one, thank goodness. Josh, how does apoptosis help protect you from cancer?
Well, they're both triggered due to DNA damage. So since apoptosis kills off cells, right? So it can kill off some of the damaged cells that could cause cancer.
Exactly. Right, so we're going to draw this like it's a flow chart. Right, so this is what they have in common, the DNA damage. So in either case, there's DNA damage. But it doesn't just go directly from DNA damage to all of a sudden you have a cancer cell. In order to become a cancer cell, that cell would first have to survive apoptosis. So DNA damage would first possibly trigger that apoptosis. If it happens to survive, if it's not damaged enough to trigger apoptosis, but it has the perfect amount of damage to be cancerous, or the right damage to be cancerous, then you might have a problem. But because you have to go through apoptosis first, it kind of protects you. That's what you're supposed to be thinking about. Right, so this can cause this, but it may trigger that apoptosis first. So then you don't have to worry about that cell becoming cancerous because it can't. It's already dead. So it's kind of a little flow chart here, but you can't go directly from DNA damage to cancer without going through apoptosis first. There are some cells that obviously do survive that process. So they have just the right damage to be cancerous, but they're not damaged enough to trigger cell death. So they can end up as cancer cells. If you wanted to write that in words, you'd probably say something like apoptosis kills cells with DNA damage before they can become cancerous. So that would be a fairly good explanation. I might want to capitalize if I want full points on my test, but your answer was pretty good too, Josh. It was a little more wordy than this one, which was not a problem. But think about that flow chart. You would really go through here first. Apoptosis could be triggered before you could become cancerous for that cell. And typically it is triggered. That's why you had that sunburn to begin with. That's why your skin did peel after the fact. And that's why you didn't end up with cancer, hopefully. Right? it's still possible that some of those cells will slip through. But hopefully your body can protect itself as a whole like this. Otherwise, other things for cancer that we need to know, those clumps of cancer cells are called what?
Tumors.
So that's probably what's in this blank here. Otherwise, you can have benign tumors versus malignant tumors. The thing that is hard to get across here is that benign tumors are bad, right? They're not good to have. But it's worse to have a malignant tumor. That mal part of that word, mal actually means bad, literally in Latin. So malicious, people that are malicious are intentionally being jerks. They're not just accidentally doing it. Right? They're trying to get in the way. So malignant is worse than benign, but that doesn't make benign good, because any benign tumor could become malignant at any point. So benign tumors stay clustered together. A malignant tumor, though, on the other hand, the reason why it's so bad is that those cells can metastasize, which is a really fancy word for saying that they can break away from that clump to affect the rest of the body. So if you had this tumor that was just skin cancer, right? Your skin is a very important organ, but if that tumor is benign, it's fairly easy to treat. All you have to do is cut it out. It's not that big of a deal. But if it's malignant, then some of those cells may break away, get into your bloodstream, travel to anywhere else in your body, attach themselves to your lungs, and now you have lung cancer too, right? So malignant is bad because it tends to spread to the rest of your body. You have those breakaway cells that end up all over the place. You have tumors all over the place because of that malignant tumor. But just because benign tumors are better than malignant doesn't mean they're good. They could ultimately become malignant. You're always going to do something like they're going to remove it if they can. If it's in your brain, if it's a tumor in your brain and it's benign, right, maybe they wouldn't try to remove it because it's very dangerous to do that. Right? But if it's easy for them to get rid of it, they'll probably just cut it out and they'll deal with it from there. But malignant tumors, that's when you really have a problem because that cancer is spreading to other places in your body. So that's the worst of the two. That's why that has the mal prefix in it. It is really bad. Otherwise, we just said that a second ago, so you do have to be a little bit cautious about this. You can actually inherit some of that damage. That's why some people are more likely to get cancer than others. But the rest of that damage has to come during your lifetime. So you're going to have to be exposed to carcinogens before it really becomes a problem. And you guys know what a carcinogen is too, I believe. You need a definition probably. But what are those things that you know of that can cause cancer? UV light, definitely. So that sunburn, there's a reason why it killed, why apoptosis was triggered. Had a lot of DNA damage there. What else? There are certain things that could cause cancer, but again, just generally say that. You want to talk about something more specific. Nicotine for one, right? In tobacco, that's known to cause cancer, which is why you're not really supposed to do that, or at least not make that stupid decision until you're old enough to deal with that yourself. But you want a few examples written down, probably. UV light, nicotine. I'm just gonna write tobacco because that's in. Nicotine's in there, tobacco.
The chemical that makes sodas diet.
There were actually some sweeteners in diet things like diet sodas that they found out might have been carcinogenic, so they took those out. They don't use those anymore. So you're okay now, but if you were drinking a diet soda in the 90s, you might have had an issue. Otherwise, and even then, sometimes they're linked to cancer, but just because there's a correlation does not mean that it's causation. So there are a lot of things that are on like a, well, maybe it causes cancer list, but they're not necessarily proven to be carcinogenic. So people are worried about them, but not necessarily 100% evidence that it does cause cancer. Unlike, say, you remember when the school didn't open very early a couple of years ago, or were you guys even in this high school yet? They were doing some construction. They redid the ceilings and stuff. There was asbestos in that. And so they had to do all sorts of special processes to come in and take that out. Now, the asbestos itself, if it was left alone, wasn't going to hurt anybody. It's not like it was dangerous to come to school. But when you start working with it, cutting it out, doing construction, then you get little bits of it floating around in the air, and you can inhale that, and it can cause lung cancer. So as long as the building wasn't on fire, and or you weren't literally trying to cut through the ceiling some way, somehow, you were safe. But because they needed to do that, to do the heating and cooling and everything, we had to close the school down. Nobody was in here. They had all sorts of hazmat stuff going on, trying to get the waste out safely, things like that. So that's another example. Maybe you guys know about it, maybe not. But it causes that specific kind of lung cancer called mesothelioma. Probably seen that on a commercial on TV, right? And I don't even know how to spell this correctly, but I'm going to make a good guess. Asbestos, that's why we have to deal with that specifically. Colin, yeah?
And it's kind of like what Josh says, but if you ever go and look at sunglasses in like the store, they'll have a tag that says there is substances in this that is known to cause cancer in like a state.
Oh, in a certain state. So in California, we believe that this causes cancer, but not necessarily everywhere else. Yeah, that's actually true. They have to put special labels depending on where it's at. But otherwise, these are things that definitely cause cancer. We know that. I'm not going to put anything that's maybe not in here,
Ammonia
but
causes type of cancer?
not necessarily. No. But yeah, it could be toxic, but that's a whole different thing.
Just gonna drink the money.
So just a couple examples. There's still asbestos all over the place. I don't know if you just have to know, like if you own an old house or something, what's going on there. There's still tile, like in that room, that chemical room that's asbestos, but unless you're trying to pull it up or drilling through it or something, it's not going to hurt anybody. So it's a thing that was used very frequently. It's actually very flame retardant, which means that the building wouldn't be as likely to be on fire as long as things were made of asbestos. But at the same time, it could cause other problems, as we found out. But we used it for a reason, obviously. Other things we need to talk about, just cancer treatment real quick. I'm going to do a couple different highlights in here, but it's okay if yours is just all the same. But there are two different types of treatment generally for cancer, and I just wanted to make sure it's clear and explain what's going on here, because I'm guessing that anybody in here would know somebody who's had either type of treatment, right? And it's important for you to understand what was going on and why they had the effects that they had. So just trying to explain that, make sure we understand it a little bit. Radiation therapy is different than chemotherapy. The radiation therapy is, if I was going to use an analogy, kind of like a sniper, right? You're going to target tumors specifically and make sure that those are the only cells that you affect. So if you had a benign tumor in your brain, they can actually focus a beam of radiation well enough and hold your head still by like screwing it into place, right, with the support. They can actually focus a beam of radiation on a tumor inside your brain without even cutting you open, and they could kill a tumor that way. So it's a good form of therapy for something that's benign, because you can target something specifically and make sure that that's the only thing that's affected. You're trying to. It's still incredibly painful for somebody who has to deal with that, right? Because if you had like a tumor in your leg and they weren't going to cut it open, they were going to use radiation treatment. It's usually for like they're not going to cut out big old parts of your bone. But if you had possible cancer or tumors in a bone, right, they might be doing something like this. But what they're trying to do, ironically, is trigger apoptosis by using the same thing that caused the cancer to begin with, just a bigger dose. Right? So they take this radiation, direct it at that cell to try and damage that DNA even more than it's already damaged, so that the cells will go through apoptosis and kill themselves. The end, right? So they're trying to cause even more damage to make those cells trigger apoptosis. It's kind of ironic because you use the same thing that caused the cancer to begin with to treat it, but you're trying to kill those cells so you damage them even further. Otherwise, chemotherapy is different. If that radiation treatment is kind of like a sniper, right? You can pick off just that one cell in thousands, trying to at least, so that it's a specific thing that's getting killed. Chemotherapy is a little bit different. This is a little bit more of a shotgun type treatment. That's you're aware that when you shoot a shotgun, not like a bird or a clay pigeon, right, there's a spread. Maybe a few of those BBs are going to hit what you were trying to hit, your target, but a lot of the other BBs are going to hit other things on the way. So if I think about chemotherapy as more of a shotgun treatment, what I mean by that is you're not actually just killing cancer cells in this. It's impossible to avoid some casualties, some innocent casualties in your body. Chemotherapy is a systemic treatment. Systemic means that it's whole body, right? So this chemical is put into your bloodstream directly, and it will affect every cell that's actively dividing. Because that's one of those characteristics for cancer cells, they're always dividing, right? So if you can target just cells that are actively dividing, you could kill cancer cells that way. But you're also going to kill other cells at the same time. Yeah, Calvin?
So that's why they usually just shave your hair off.
It targets rapidly, actively dividing cells. And we talked about what cells that are actively, rapidly dividing all the time anyway. Your skin cells. And your hair follicles are in your skin, right? So that's the reason why your skin tends to, some of your skin will slough off, some of the hair follicles will fall out, right? That's part of the reason why you have those side effects from chemotherapy, because not just cancer cells, also your skin cells are affected. Any cell that's rapidly and actively dividing is going to be affected by this. But the hope is that they're getting cancer cells, all of the cancer cells, and only damaging some of your other cells. Right? It's still enough to make you feel terrible, right? Your skin cells, right? There's a lot of sores and there's a lot of hair falling out and things like that. But at the same time, we also talked about how the lining of your stomach and intestines also divide very frequently. That's where the vomiting, diarrhea, that kind of stuff comes into play, right? It's not a pretty thing. It's not a fun thing for anybody to go through. But hopefully all of those cancer cells get killed in this process. And the only reason you would resort to chemotherapy is because there was a malignant tumor and you have no idea where that cancer is. It's all over the place now, right? So you have to basically treat everywhere, systemic, but you're only trying to affect cells that are actively dividing, not those that are not dividing. So your brain cells really aren't affected by this a lot at all, unless you are developing still. This would be more dangerous for a kid than it would be an adult, right? So it could affect your development to a certain extent. So chemotherapy, not a good thing, but it does help treat cancer because it does kill cancer cells. It's just also killing other cells at the same time, which is what makes it so ugly. The radiation treatments, though, usually those are targeted well enough that it doesn't affect surrounding tissues. It still could have an effect on those surrounding tissues, but definitely if you had this radiation treatment in like your hip, it's probably not going to affect your brain very much, right? But you're targeting here specifically. Here you're not so much, but you should be able to kill all the cancer cells because they're actively dividing. You're just going to kill a lot of other cells at the same time. That's what the problem is. So they're completely different treatments. One is used only like in drastic cases. If you have a malignant tumor that's spreading and you don't know where the cancer is, you have to do this. There's no other option really. But if there's no need to do that chemotherapy, you know where that tumor is, you don't think it's metastasizing, spreading, then you might use that radiation treatment instead. And you might use a combination of the two. It kind of depends. But there's also decisions to be made there that would just be your own decision ethically, right? If you were 95 years old and you're thinking, I want to go through this for a couple of years just to live another 10 years, maybe, right? Maybe you decide, no, I don't want to do the chemotherapy, right? But I would assume that if you were the age that you are and you have a full life ahead of you, you might want to go through the treatment just to make sure that you could live long enough to do the things you want to do. So hopefully that explains things a little bit. If you guys had questions, we can look things up too, because I don't know everything. Most of what we know about the cell cycle, is if you look at this note down here, actually comes from cancer research. So most of these things that you're learning right now, the G1, S, G2, the only reason we even know what those are is because people are looking at cells and how they divide, because they're worried about curing cancer, trying to cure cancer. So most of that money goes towards the research that helps us learn more about this stuff. So, and cancer is a big one. There's a lot of money out there for that. So that research, there's a lot of opportunities. If maybe you're interested in something like this, you could work in a lab someday doing this. But